Alright everyone, we start off today with our main video being about Slate actually. They are left-wing legacy media. I guess you could kind of call them missing link media. I don't think they ever had a newspaper presence, but they lean towards that corporate side of things, and even they at Slate, and this isn't an opinion piece, link in the description, archived of course. This isn't even like, oh, they got a token conservative, Piers Morgan, Ted Cruz decided to write an op-ed. This is a mainline article from them. They're pointing out that it's a bad idea that Joe Biden he's painted himself into a corner. I'll get into that, but he's pledging that the SCOTUS nominee that he puts forward will be a black female. Apparently, a supermajority of Americans and even a slim majority of Democrats don't want him to do that. They want him to consider all possible applicants for the position. I mean, that makes sense. In any sane reckoning of how governance is supposed to work, you would say you would want the most qualified individual. Now, what a Democrat considers qualified to replace Breyer, obviously, would be far left of center, more like a Kagan or something. But that doesn't necessitate that it be a black female. It's like if you were to say, oh, I want the first openly gay SCOTUS justice. Well, I mean, that does rankle some people because there's a potential pool of people who aren't gay who might be more qualified. You should pick the most qualified candidate regardless. This brings up a big problem for Joe Biden. The id poll side of things, to have the first black female Supreme Court justice, is very, very important to a small subset of the Democrats. Something like a quarter, maybe a third of Democrats fall into that id poll category. It's the only thing that they care about. Biden already made the pledge. He has no choice but to stick with it. If he were to go back on this, you would end up with leftoids that don't really like Biden much anyway, using it as an attack line among black voters. And right now, the Democrats are hemorrhaging Hispanic support. They've alienated a lot of the white sort of union voters, which is a shrinking proportion of the party, but it's still a double-digit proportion. That working middle class sort of union America spine that really, really matters in a state like Pennsylvania. Michigan comes to mind. Certainly Ohio, Minnesota, those lakes area and upper Midwest states. The problem is it's a no-win scenario for him. I would ask this, and this is rhetorical because the answer, of course, is obvious. How is a black female ideologue worse than a white male one? Breyer was already far to the left ideologically, and really when you're talking about SCOTUS, it's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter who Biden replaces Breyer with. They will vote in line roughly with what Breyer voted, which is fine, by the way. The composition of the court is maintained. Some of their recent decisions have been reasonably good. It's been a mixed bag, but I would say tilts more towards reality land when it comes to the Constitution, because Trump got 3 justices. Biden's not replacing a conservative with a liberal, and he certainly is not going to put a conservative on the court in place of Breyer. The composition doesn't change. Who cares? Now, first and foremost, before I get deeper into the topic, keep in mind, down below, if you're watching this video on YouTube, there will be a pinned comment with links to other video hosting sites that I use. Keep in mind, I make exclusive content every single day on those video platforms that doesn't get onto YouTube. These days, I'm making a single video each day. By the way, my big announcement, I've actually decided to shift it to the 22nd of February, so there's no missing video or anything. I will be appearing, I believe, later today with the Lotus Eaters, actually, so the schedule got a little bit full, so I had to push that back, and the 22nd of February is more mimetic than the 2nd anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Here's the thing. When Slate is questioning an in-poll move from the left, wing of the Democratic Party, don't you think that perhaps that's a problem? Normally they wouldn't do this. I mean, you're not going to get questioned by Salon or HuffPo or any of the more specifically in-poll leftist outlets. But Slate's pretty far out there. Again, and they may not be Huffington Post, but they're close to it. And when they're mentioning polls and saying, hey, 75+% of Americans don't want Biden to choose a person based on their race, the color of their skin, and their gender. The problem is this. He's going to choose a black female. I mean, unless he's completely nuts. The problem is that when he does that, because of his previous pledge, even if that individual is the most qualified. And that's possible. When you're looking at a slew of people on the far left, they're all going to be far left. They're all unqualified by reason of not understanding like the Second Amendment and shit. But what if the least unqualified among them truly is a black female? Whoopi Goldberg, I guess, is off the list at the moment. Well, it's still going to look like an id poll hire. It's going to look like Joe Biden, the diversity hire old white man who just chose the help. It's going to look racist. That's the problem for the far left. Joe Biden can't get anything right. He never should have made that pledge to begin with. Of course, his campaigner-in-chief, Biden, who frequently had crowds of above 10 people watching him, rarely much more than that, though, you'll remember, honk honk, it was a bad idea. That was to try to get like people on the left aboard the Biden bus, which already had several flat tires and a ruined ventilation system by that point, like an old hippie bus that hasn't really been maintained since 1963 or something. Big problem, because you've already stated that it's going to be a diversity hire, effectively. So even if you come out and you say, no, it's not going to be, you can't help but alienate a chunk of the party. If it's not a black female, well, it's a promise broken. We'll say id poll leftoid voters that care about that. They're already flocking out of Biden's support group. So some of them are just hanging on by a thread. I think that would be a bridge too far for many of them. If it is, then the center of the party will assume that it's id poll related. Even if you did vet them properly, said, look, this is the most qualified person in this group that we were considering, happens to be a black female, and Biden can say, well, I'm happy about that, I pledged that, but really it's not because of the gender or the color of the skin that I'm hiring them. It doesn't matter. Dem voters that disapprove of that move will still consider it that way. The optics are terrible for this. I don't expect that this relatively major shakeup of the court, I mean, it'd be bigger if it were a conservative justice died or something and Biden gets the chance to go far left, which I think he probably would be forced to do. But replacing a SCOTUS justice at all, not every president even gets the chance to do that. Normally, you would expect this is a good way to solidify at least the in-party base, maybe leaning independent voters, but he doesn't get the chance to do that because he screwed the pooch as campaigner. And he may not have thought that he'd get a SCOTUS pick. Hell, Biden might not have been part of the joke, may have thought that he would lose. He is a steward, after all. He wasn't chosen to be a leader. He was chosen to be a steward figurehead for puppet masters to be able to manipulate the country in the direction of the Great Reset thing. Well, he might not have even been fucking aware of it. His own internal polls clearly didn't compel him to go to more rallies or say, hey, maybe we can talk to more than 20 people at a time. It might be more effective. It looked more pathetic than when Hillary Clinton showed up there at that barn and there were like 50 people watching her. That was a big crowd compared to most of what Biden was ever able to pull in. And looking at his inauguration, similar thing. Anyway, one would think the party, for optical and polling purposes, would be slightly upset about Slate jumping the gun. Again, if this were center-left media Acme Incorporated, well, they'd say, well, it's just bullshit. They're scaring themselves because the Dems have low approval right now, and they're imagining all sorts of boogeymen politically are going to rear their ugly heads and harm our midterm prospects. This is Slate. Again, let that sink in. It's sort of like when CNN is critical of a Biden policy. You know that policy must really be sucky. Build Back Better is dead now. OSHA mandate, watered down infrastructure bill. In fact, there's nothing for the Democrats to run on in the midterms. That's already become apparent. It's already a big problem. Well, this is just another thing that could have been at least an in-party win. It could have energized some voters. Instead, you can energize a small group of far leftists, which is great. Biden needs that energy right now, to tell the truth, while alienating the center left. Or you can switch. You can maybe keep the center left aboard, but then you've lied. Your pledge was broken, and broad sections of Democrats wouldn't like it. I imagine he'll stick with the original plan. He'll have to cover his ass by saying, look, how dare you insinuate that I would do the diversity hire thing even though I claimed that I was going to do it. We vetted them for days and days, and Of course, Biden wasn't part of that process, of course. He's busy eating a bran muffin and having his 2 o'clock nap like a baby. We vetted them over and over again, and how dare you claim that my nominee is not the most qualified or that I would possibly go through with my pledge previous. It's just totally coincidental that it happens to line up with what I pledged to do. And there are some Democrats, by the way, and there are plenty of Republicans that would be like this if the shoe was on the other foot, so not being a partisan here, there are people who will believe it. They really are that low info. I mean, the founders never intended for them to be considered mentally sane enough to vote. Unfortunately, we decided to abandon that basic principle. That's where some of our problems originate, by the way, as a country. That's about all. Peace out.